Hello and welcome to It's Always Winter but Never Christmas. This is the Oxford Centre for Fantasy, spending time with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and special guests on the theme of the holiday season. Now, as you can see, we have with us Malcolm Guite, poet and writer and Anglican priest, and Kath Langrish, who is a novelist and fairy and folktale expert. And it's a great delight because they both are experts on all things Tolkien and Lewis. So we're going to have a lot of fun in this session now. So first of all, just thinking about Christmas, the first of these writers between Lewis and Tolkien that you tend to think of is, of course, C.S. Lewis. And I think he's almost got his own Christmas season now, thanks to the stage versions of The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. I mean, that's for two reasons. Obviously, it has the wonderful snowy landscapes, which lend themselves to Christmas shows, but also it has the very special arrival of a Christmas guest in the middle, and we'll come to him in a minute. But perhaps we'd like to start by saying, what are your memories of either Tolkien or Lewis in connection with your own Christmases back in the day? Did you have any special moments that you remember? Kath, I think you had a story that you told me.
Yes, well, it just so happens that on the Christmas I was 8, I think it was, my mother, I always used to get books for Christmas because I was a massive bookworm even then. And my mother must have picked for me one of the Narnia books. She cannot have realised that there was a series, I think, because she chose the silver chair. And so as I was opening my Christmas presents, amongst all the Enid Blytons, out popped this book, The Silver Chair. And it had a cover, the famous Puffin book, with the cover by Pauline Baynes, featuring the underground caverns and lots of little gnomes or goblins. And I looked at this and I shuddered. It really put me off. I didn't think I was going to like this book at all, because about a year earlier, I'd come across a truly dreadful fairy tale called The Hobbies in my school reading book, featuring extremely unpleasant little goblins, and this completely freaked me out. So I left The Silver Chair to the very last of my Christmas books, but I really couldn't resist. I mean, it was a book I hadn't read, and I think my mother knew that I would come around to it in the end, and so I opened it, and I was just blown away. You know, there I was in this amazing world of fairy tale talking owls and castles and lost princes and green ladies and serpents, and it was so exciting and so relatable, and even though a fairy tale, so very physical, I was just enchanted. And of course this was in the 60s, and sort of C.S. Lewis was really huge. All my friends were reading the same books, and we almost formed this bond at school where we'd talk about Narnia. It wasn't even that we wanted to be there. We wanted to go there. It wasn't so much that we wanted to have adventures there. We simply wanted to be there. So it really was one of the best Christmas presents in my life, I think, really.
How about you, Malcolm? Did you ever get something like that for Christmas?
That's wonderful. I do love that thing, Kath, about just wanting to be there, not necessarily just to have adventures there, but to be there.
Yes.
The quality of the land itself. Well, being there, or at least Christmas and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe had a sort of early association for me, which is slightly odd because I was born in Nigeria and brought up there and in Zimbabwe until I was 10. And although each year we went back to England on leave, it was almost always in the summer. But solemnly at Christmas, in both Nigeria and Zimbabwe, the expat community exchanged Christmas cards with robins in the snow. And, you know, snow falling everywhere and fir trees and sleigh bells and reindeer. And I would be curious as a little boy, what is this white stuff? What's that? Oh, that's from back home. You know, you'll get that way, because they always referred to somewhere else as home, whereas I didn't know any other home other than the place with the pawpaws and the bananas and the beautiful palms. You know, so then eventually one Christmas, an African Christmas, I was, amidst all the other cards, I was given a copy of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And there was all this snow and fur coats and snow and fir trees. And so there was a sort of strange fusion in my mind going on between Narnia and England. And so I kind of wanted, I somehow thought perhaps England becomes more magical in the winter. There was something. And in fact, my favourite of the Narnia stories I got to later, remains my favourite, is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And I was excited because that mentioned the actual name of a place in England as the start of the story. And that place was Cambridge. And eventually we suddenly left, very suddenly when I sort of was a bit too old, but about 9 or 10, we very suddenly left Zimbabwe. Ian Smith, as it was Rhodesia then, had declared UDI, had essentially an illegal government. My father was opposed to his racist interference into the life of the university. Anyway, we ended up being expelled. Well, in fact, my mother and my sister left first. And the place we went to was Cambridge. And I had this secret excitement. Somewhere in Cambridge, there is a house with a picture of a Narnian ship. I need to find the house and look at the picture. I tried the backs of various wardrobes. So yes, there was a sort of magical thing and something about homecoming blended in because of Christmas and the snow.
Wow.
I think for me, my association is not from my own childhood, but from my children's childhoods. So many years ago when they were very little, toddlers, their godfather lived at the Kilns, which is C.S. Lewis's home, and where young professionals live during most of the year, and then they move out to allow the C.S. Lewis Society to have their summer courses. Anyway, so whilst the godfather was living there, the people living there decided to throw a Christmas party for the children of their friends. And the way the Kilns works is that the attic has a it's not up in a sort of through a ladder, it runs along the eaves. So they took the back off a wardrobe.
Oh, wow.
And they put it over the attic door, and then they dressed the inside of the attic with, I suppose, cotton wool and fairy lights and a lamppost, and then put fake fur coats in the wardrobe. So the children literally in C.S. Lewis's house walked through a wardrobe into the attic. And that's my abiding memory of that, which was so special.
That's lovely.
So let's go back to the sort of the theme of Christmas in the actual books. And obviously, in terms of C.S. Lewis and Narnia, we're talking about a world of talking animals. That's how he thought of it. That's the sort of nub of the idea behind it. But you get much more than talking animals in Narnia. And you get some very strange guests turning up, including lots of guests from Greek mythology and others. But famously, in The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, you also get the arrival of Father Christmas.
That's wonderful.
What is he doing there? Now, Kath, can you help us? Can you help us with this?
Well, yeah, I know actually, a lot of readers don't like Father Christmas's appearance in Narnia, and they feel he's sort of somehow out of place there. In fact, my husband says that as a little boy, he felt it was something wrong about it. Personally, I never minded, although I do think possibly Lewis was wise not to invite him back. But frankly, when a writer's come up with a wonderful phrase like always winter and never Christmas, I know they tell you to kill your darlings, but I don't think that's a darling that, you can bring yourself to kill. So he had to do something. And let me just remind you how Lewis describes him. You've got to remember where it happens. The beavers and the Pevensies have escaped from the dam. Yes, because the White Witch is after them, and they've realised that Edmund has betrayed them. And they're hiding in a hole in a riverbank, and they hear sleigh bells. And they fear that it may be the White Witch. So Mr. Beaver bravely goes out to look. And of course, he finds it's not the White Witch. It's Father Christmas with his brown reindeer. And he calls them out. And then we are told that what they see is a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall over his chest. And then we're told that he was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. So I think he knows that there's a little bit I've missed out where he's told that they knew who he was immediately, but he's not like you think of him here. He's got this extra presence. And I think that the Hollyberry comparison now reminds me of the Green Knight in Gawain the Green Knight, Bertilac, who rides into Arthur's hall with a holly branch in his hand, the greatest in green when groves are bare, and combines pagan, giant, elf, and Christian in a single figure. But I'm also reminded of other winter spirits. There's the Russian Morosko, Father Frost. And in Russian fairy tales, he's the white-bearded spirit of the snowy woods, who may, if you address him very politely, give you gifts instead of freezing you to death. I have a little picture here by Ivan Bilibin. You have to look a little bit carefully. I don't know if you can see him, but there you will see the figure of Moroshko addressing a shivering damsel who's waiting for him in the woods. And this comes from a fairy tale collected by Alexander I can never say this. Alexander Afanasiev. There you go. And in this fairy tale, a jealous stepmother persuades her husband to take his daughter out into the woods on a cold winter night and leave her to die in the forest. She says, "Drive Martha to her bridegroom, old man. Drive into the forest, right up to the big pine that stands on the hill, and there hand Martha over to Morosko, Frost." And I thought I would just read what happens, because here I have this ancient book of Russian fairy tales, and the girl is left shivering in the forest. She sat and shivered. The cold had pierced her through. She would have cried aloud, but she had not strength enough, only her teeth chattered. Suddenly she heard a sound. Not far off, Frost was crackling away on a fir. From fir to fir he was leaping and snapping his fingers. Presently he appeared on the very pine under which the maiden was sitting, and from above her head he cried, "Art thou warm, maiden?" "Warm, warm am I, dear Father Frost," she replied. Frost began to descend lower, all the more crackling and snapping his fingers. To the maiden, said Frost, "Art thou warm, maiden? Art thou warm, fair one?" "Warm am I, Frost dear. Warm am I, Father dear." Frost began cracking more than ever, and more loudly did he snap his fingers, and to the maiden he said, "Art thou warm, maiden? Art thou warm, pretty one? Art thou warm, my darling?" The girl was by this time numb with cold, and she could scarcely make herself heard as she replied, "Oh, quite warm, Frost, dearest." Now Frost then takes pity on the girl. He wraps her up in furs and blankets, and next day when the stepmother sends her father out to bring back the body, she's sitting there dressed in a beautiful bridal shawl with a casket of jewels, and of course this gets taken back, and then, of course, the stepmother sends her own daughters out into the woods with the hope that they will come back with a similar bounty, only they're rude to Grandfather Frost and freeze to death.
Oh.
So I checked, and it seems that Morosko was originally a Slavic snow spirit or winter wizard. Apparently he was suppressed under the Soviet Union as being a bit too fanciful and sort of suspiciously sort of churchy. Which is strange, but is now very popular again. And I've even found a picture of that Vladimir Putin meeting an effigy of Morosko. And he is very similar. I mean, he's got the long white beard, the fur coat, the fur hat, the boots. He carries a magic staff and he rides in a troika. But going back to Father Christmas, our Father Christmas has got very different origin from the American Santa Claus. He's not descended from St. Nicholas. He's a spirit or a personification of the winter festival. Mm-hmm. And you'll find that in the 16th century, a character called Father Yule used to parade through the city of York on the winter solstice, December the 21st, riding a goat or being drawn in a carriage pulled by a goat, carrying a loaf of bread and a leg of lamb. And this custom was suppressed in 1572 by an annoyed archbishop. He appeared in masques and entertainments throughout the Tudor period as Captain Christmas or Sir Christmas. And in a court masque of 1638, in which Shrovetide and Christmas sort of vie for supremacy. Christmas appears as an old reverend gentleman in a furred gown and cap, who proclaims, "I am the king of good cheer and feasting, though I come but once a year to reign over baked, boiled, roast and plum porridge." So I think if you can set aside the very commercial Father Christmas that we're unfortunately stuck with today, his appearance in Narnia is a lot easier to accept. If you think of him as having this ancestry of ancient winter spirit, whose appearance signifies celebration and feasting in the middle of very harsh weather, I think it's easier to sort of accept, if you've got problems with this at all, which I don't, to be honest.
Yeah.
I was always impressed by the gifts that he comes with. It's not like the ones that I got at the end of my bed, you know, a sword, a bow and arrow, but also a tea service.
Very useful.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And not to mention, mending Mrs. Beaver's giving Mrs. Beaver an entire sewing machine.
Indeed.
Exactly in the drawings like the ones my mother had and used. My mother actually in appearance was very like Mrs. Beaver. She's quite small and round and often sitting at a Singer sewing machine. So I always loved that. No, I have to say I delighted in the whole Father Christmas episode. It didn't, partly because I was so little when I got that first line, The Witch in the Wardrobe, that I needed help. And my mother and father between them read it to me. And it was partly why I think I was associated my mother with Mrs. Beaver, who was very pleased about this. And my father, did all the voices wonderfully and did a very good Father Christmas. I was very excited by that episode because I had an ear and an eye for detail, and I had remembered that the White Witch had instructed her minions not to take the bells when she went on the sleigh in pursuit. So I thought, oh, bells, is it? But I thought there were no bells. And then it's a wonderful dramatic moment where just where they think is to be the most danger comes this jovial, convivial, wonderful spirit of encouragement.
With
and, I was just so. I mean, I'm totally with you, Kath, on the let's not go back to an American tradition or even Saint Nick in that sense. Certainly not the diminutive little figure of the night before Christmas. There is this is Father Yule. This is a great embodiment of the kind of warmth and feasting, and the whole essentially human spirit that says when things are bleak and cold outside, we shall be snug, we shall have warmth, we shall have it's the person who gets that snugness and warmth, and indeed that whole spirit so well as Dickens, of course, and in some ways Dickens' convivial green-clad Christmas spirit in Christmas Carol is very much there. There's a brilliant short story which I'm sure Lewis knew. Not short story. It's just a little anecdote almost in Chesterton's Tremendous Trifles, where Chesterton meets Father Christmas. He finds him in a little shop in a dingy back street in Battersea, and he's very worried about it. And he says, "Oh, I'm not very well." He refuses to take money for a toy that Chesterton is buying. He says, "I can't. It's a newfangled thing, taking money. I can't do it. I've always given things away." And then Chesterton says, "Why, you might be Father Christmas." He says, "Well, I am. I'm not very well at the moment. I've been declining." And then suddenly Charles Dickens walks into the shop and says, "But he was dying in my time. Good to see you, Father Christmas." And then Sir Richard Steele walks in and says, "But I believe he was dying in my time." And then Robin Hood steps in, and the whole shop, the story's called The Shop of Ghosts, is full of people going right back into English history and literature for whom this figure has been important, all of whom were slightly worried that he was dying in their time, and that he needed reviving. So anyway, all of that. But I mentioned the joviality, and there's a very interesting thing that, as I'm sure you know, deep and important as was the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien, and vital as was Lewis's role in being, as Tolkien himself said at one point, his only audience, his only readership, and asking more for him. Tolkien was to some degree out of sympathy with the Narnia project, and one of the things that he found most irritating explicitly was Father Christmas, and that was because, in spite of his having produced these wonderful Father Christmas letters, but the reason was to do with his sense of genre and form. And he didn't think you could mix mythologies. He simply thought you cannot have fawns and Father Christmas in the same secondary world. There's a dissonance and a mismatch. Now, Michael Ward, in his wonderful book Planet Narnia, has ably defended Lewis by pointing out that, as it were, each of the 7 chronicles is under the sort of presiding genius or tutelar spirit of one of the medieval 7 heavens, one of which, of course, is the sphere of Jove or Jupiter, from which we get the word jovial. And also ideas, Jupiter is associated, of course, with kingship, with royalty, but through kingship and royalty, he's associated with largesse, generosity, feasting, and he's the opposite, as it were, of the freezing Saturn. He's, so according to Ward's theory, the sign under which the whole of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is Jupiter, just as the sign of the Dawn Treader is Sol, the sun, or the sign of the Silver Chair is the moon. And he therefore thinks that Lewis produces a kind of consistency of feel throughout the book by taking the associated cluster of ideas in relation to Jupiter. So kingship is obviously a great theme of the thing. I mean, the whole point of the story in some sense is that they're going to be crowned as the kings and queens in Cair Paravel, and they're on that journey. Good feasting, the feasting produced by Father Christmas, is the prime thing. But in that book, you constantly get the shadow side of each thing. So the shadow side of the good feasting, the false Christmassy gift, is the gift of the Turkish delight of the Queen. And she also promises a false kingship.
Yes.
To Edmund. So you get it's a wonderfully Augustinian book. You get the sense that all the evil in that book are corruptions of an initial good. There's a good version of everything that has an enormous yes waiting behind everything, every small perversion that has to be said no to. There's the big yes version of it. So there's the feast at Cair Paravel. And so in a sense, Father Christmas, in that sheer bonhomie and largesse and giving and serious giving, with no strings attached, no exaction, is the kind of good counterbalance to the parallel encounter in snowy woods with a quasi-mythical figure. And that she is a kind of snow queen, of course. So in a sense, I think Lewis has taken 2 big mythical figures. I'm sure your Russian counterparts are all in there, just as the Hans Andersen, the snow queen is there. Yeah. And he's used the one to counterbalance the other. So I think the whole Father, I mean, I don't think it would be the same book if you omitted that episode. I think it's a very important part in the whole constellation of goodness that is clustering around the image of the jovial and all giving king.
I like that, and I'm now seeing the Father Christmas's wonderful cup of hot, strong tea with cream in it as the counterpart or the opposite of the Snow Queen's drink, which I think she sort of it's not really a drink, is it? But she sort of drops from a bottle some liquid as it falls and produces, I think, Turkish delight at the bottom. Maybe it is.
She also produces a drink. She also
sherbet. That's right, or something like that. Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely not very good for Edmund either.
So
anyway, I've always enjoyed Father Christmas, and I mean, obviously I don't like the toy Santa. It's always interesting for me, of course, particularly since my hair sort of turned white at this time of year, when I'm walking along the streets or in trains, very small children tug their mothers and point excitedly to me, and I say something. I'm on holiday before the big season, you know.
Wonderful.
I think that's a wonderful image to take away with us from the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But if we were looking to do more Christmas shows with a C.S. Lewis feel, are any of the other books that he writes lending themselves to this season? I was thinking, Kath, of your mention of the Silver Chair, which actually does have a wintry Yule feel to it, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, apart from the fact that I was given the book at Christmas, and it would have been a snowy Christmas because it was probably sort of 1963, 64, which was very, very snowy. Yes, I mean, there's nothing quite so cozy, is there? This is what Malcolm was saying about sitting in a lovely warm house, reading about a freezing winter journey. So, yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily Christmas time because the Giant's Feast in Harfang is called the Autumn Feast, but they do get there through a blizzard.
And they are eating, just to mention, they're eating turkey.
Oh yes, I'd forgotten about that.
As well as and humans, but you know, turkey first.
Well, they also eat sort of a talking deer, I think, don't they? Talking stag, which is very sad. But yes, and I just remember, and I still enjoy this, reading about, you know, their miserable struggle up the wet, soaking, snow-filled ledges, you know, arriving at the gate of Harfang, bruised and miserable and tired and crotchety, and then being welcomed into this, you know, into the apparent, the deceptive warmth and shelter of Harfang. And what always struck me, even when I was a child, was the sheer physical pleasure of the contrast, if you like, of Jill having a bath in a giant tub that's so large you can swim in it, hot water so much that you can swim in it, and then getting out and having an enormous, like acres of giant towel on which all you have to do is roll around in front of the fire to get dry. And frankly, anybody of my generation, and possibly your generation, Malcolm, who lived in a pretty sort of chilly house without double glazing, you know, heated mostly by coal fires, you know, getting out of a bath to get yourself dry in a pretty chilly bathroom, the idea of being able to just roll around on a great big towel in front of a huge fire was wonderful. I mean, I always wanted to try that.
Wonderful. I always think, you know, all the sort of physical pleasures in those books are partly driven, I think, by the really quite dire experience of England immediately after the war in terms of rationing, not a lot of fuel for heating, drafty rooms, short commons. To give the children, at least in these books, these wonderful feasts and unashamedly glorious feasts. So there's, I suppose, the other, I mean, perhaps this is a bit wicked, I don't know, but another feature you might think from the Harfang scenes that might be familiar to some people from Christmas parties is Puddleglam having a little bit more of the bottle than is good for him and getting himself a bit, there's a wonderful bit where he keeps on trying to say, but can't quite manage to say, I'm a respectable marshwiggle. And he says, respectabiggle, I'm a respectabiggle. And then, of course, he makes out that he was only pretending in order to, you know, and you know, it's a lovely bit of sort of weakness in Puddleglam. I mean, Puddleglam is one of my favourite characters in that book. And
totally.
The lovely idea of the sort of, the apparently gloomy person who has this inner courage, and when he seizes on a thing that's really the case, changes the course of the story. So, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, thinking about the other books, they don't have, I mean, the obvious thing to say, if we want to speak, of course, he was very careful many times over, Lewis, to say that it's not an allegory, but a supposal, and that he's only trying to think of supposing that God Almighty were to be born into another world, which was a world of animals. Of course, he would be a lion and so on. But even given that it's a supposal and not an allegory, it is quite striking that there are no infancy narratives for Aslan. Aslan always appears, I mean, in that sense, I mean, although he draws on John a lot, in terms of the narrative arc, the Narniad is much more like Mark's gospel. Of course, Mark's symbol is the lion. When Mark's gospel, Jesus appears immediately, he's there, you know, John the Baptist proclaims him, and he's there, he's adult, he's fully formed, he's come to proclaim the kingdom, which is exactly what Aslan does, to usurp I mean, you know, it's quite Markian sort of feel to that. And of course, Mark doesn't have the infancy narrative, so we don't have that, and I don't think Lewis could have done it successfully, and I think he knew he couldn't. So the closest he gets to it, in some sense, of another transformation, which isn't so much Christmassy, in fact, it's kind of more Eastery, but is the appearance at the end of the Dawn Treader as the Lamb, and a direct quotation from John 21, "Come and have breakfast," and the fish grilling on the thing, and those who encounter him getting out of a boat in order to do so, and so on. So that's very very clear. But I think the Christmas associations with the others are much more to do with those of us who were lucky enough to have these books doled out to us with a year in between, waiting desperately for the next one and waiting for Christmas to come so that the next book would come. Even though, you know, I was reading them after the series had been completed, my parents sensibly didn't go out and get the box set. You know, they they let me live with a book for quite a while, and then they gave me the next one.
I longed to own the boxed set, but I never ever did.
I eventually bought it, of course. I mean,
yeah.
I've lived with and read and reread these books sort of all my adult life. So then, of course, I did have the pleasure of reading them to my children. And though for me, I think the Christmas side of it is much more to do with the snugness, the conviviality, the sense that we shall have a feast. I mean, there's a wonderful description of the feast that's set out and renewed every day on Aslan's table.
Oh, yes.
At the end of the dawn treader, and the bird come, and and that, I think that defended me. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to say this at the time, but it defended me imaginatively and at a very deep level from docetism, and Jesus wasn't really in the flesh, or from an over spiritualized religion, from any sort of pure denial of the goodness, of what Dante calls the holy and glorious flesh. I think all that good, honest, thoroughly enjoyable, unashamed, celebratory feasting around something holy.
Yeah, they are very celebratory books.
Of course, the direct Our Christmas reference in the Narniad, Lewis saves for the very last one, where he deliberately makes it a stable into which they're all driven, but the stable really is the door into, in a sense, contains that, and they realize inside the stable is the whole of Narnia and then Aslan's country. And it's left to Lucy, of course, who's always the most perspicuous, and I mean, her name Lucy means light. She always sees to the heart of everything, Lucy. She says, in our world, and a stable in our world once contained something bigger than the whole world. Lewis is probably thinking of that beautiful line of John Donne's to Mary, actually, where he says, immensity cloistered in thy dear womb. So, yeah, there's a lovely little reference just at the end of the Narniad to the stable.
Yes.
So whilst we're in the stable, perhaps, Malcolm, you might want to read us the nativity poem by C.S. Lewis himself. It's a poem which you might have met in an anthology, but let's enjoy the season with his poetry.
I love this. He's thinking about the beasts at the stable. It's a poem of great humility, actually, but also and of a kind of quiet humour, self-deprecating humour. The Nativity. Among the oxen, like an ox, I'm slow. I see a glory in the stable grow, which, with ox's dullness, might at length give me an ox's strength. Amongst the asses, stubborn I as they, I see my Saviour where I looked for hay. So may my beast-like folly learn at least the patience of a beast. Among the sheep, I like a sheep have strayed. I watch the manger where my Lord is laid. Oh, that my buying nature would thence win some woolly innocence.
That's a fabulous poem.
Win thence, yeah.
Yeah. Malcolm, you mentioned that he also has a more serious riff on this in his thinkings about Milton's ode. Perhaps we won't read all of that,
it's kind of very curious thing. I don't know if I've got a moment. So Milton, as you know, wrote a poem called Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, which is a long, beautiful. I'm just hoping I've got the Lewis poem here. I had it marked, but it's a long, beautiful poem which starts off in Spenserian stanzas and asks to come ahead of the Magi and be at the stable, and then it moves to a different meter, a rather beautiful lyrical meter. It was the winter wild when the heaven-born child meanly wrapped, and it has the idea that that when Christ was born, this is Milton has this idea. It was a classical idea that there was a moment when Christ was born when everything was completely still, when the angels sang and proclaimed peace, that there was peace, that every war ceased, for a moment, every spear was held in the hand and not released. And it was the turn of the tide. Everything was going to change from here. And all over the empire. So the story went. People, as it were, paused for breath. You know what I mean? So Lewis wrote this rather extraordinary poem, The Turn of the Tide, in which he not only imagines the world stilled, but he imagines a wave, as it were, of breathless stillness. Is it, this is the turn. This is the moment when the creator from beyond all things enters the creation, and the entire creation is thus transfigured and can never be the same again. I'll just give you a few phrases of it, because I think it starts and ends in Bethlehem. It's a poem that starts in Bethlehem, goes out to the furthest ends of the cosmos, and then comes back to Bethlehem. I'll just give you the opening and the closing, the Bethlehem bits, because they're really beautiful. Breathless was the air over Bethlehem. Black and bare were the fields, hard as granite the clods, hedges stiff with ice, the sedge in the vice of the pool like pointed rods. And the deathly stillness spread from Bethlehem. It was shed wider each moment on the land, through rampart and wall, into camp, into hall, stole the hush, the tongues were at a stand. And he goes out, and everybody pauses. There's a complete stillness. And he imagines this stillness as deathly, like people are thinking, is this it? Time has stopped for a second. Is this the end? The cosmos is coming to an end. And that's why it's deathly, it's breathless. And there's one sense, of course, in which it is. The old order is coming to its end there. And then he goes right out. He imagines great salamanders in the sun, brandish as they run, tails like the Americas in size, were stunned by it. And then everything is completely still, and they wonder if this is the beginning of the entropy, of the unworking of everything. The death had almost come, the tide lay motionless at ebb. And then there's a gap in the poem, and he picks up the thread again. There's literally a pause of blank paper. Like a stab at the movement over crab and bowman, over maiden and lion, came the shock of returning life. The start and burning pang at heart, setting galaxies to tingle and rock, and the Lord's dead to breathe, and the swords were sheathed, and a rustling and a relaxing began, with rumour of noise of the resuming joys. On the nerves of the universe it ran, then pulsing into space with delicate dulcet pace came a music. This is from the Milton Ode. Milton says, ring out ye crystal spheres, once bless our human ears, if ye have power to touch our senses. So now the music is coming. A music infinitely small and clear, but it swelled and drew near and held all worlds in the sharpness of its call, and now divinely deep and louder with the sweep of quivering and inebriating sound. Wonderful. And so it comes this great revel and mirth and joy in all the spheres. And then the poem ends like this. So death lay in a rest, but at Bethlehem, the blessed, nothing greater could be heard than a dry wind in the thorn, the cry of one newborn, and cattle in stall as they stirred. But of course, the one newborn has a capital A. It's a wonderful kind of out from the moment in the stable to the end of the cosmos, and then back to the dry wind and just the cry of the babe. But everything has changed.
I think what's extraordinary about that is that's not a voice I associate with C.S. Lewis. The first one, the Nativity with the calling himself an ass, is totally something totally in his wheelhouse. But that I think it's quite. I must go away and read that again.
It's great. I mean, he's partly under Milton. He's allowing himself a Miltonic moment. But there's another side. I wrote the chapter on Lewis as a poet for the Cambridge Companion, so I spent some time really soaking myself in Lewis's poetry and benefited from that enormously. But one of the things I became aware of is that if you want to know where all the deep, rather mystical, immanent God, Barfieldian stuff went in Lewis when he didn't quite put it in the more orthodox book, the answer is he went into the poetry. He's very Owen Barfield, very sort of original participation and final participation and organic unity. Lewis the poet allows himself a much richer sense of You know, Lewis the theologian is often at pains to emphasize the transcendence of God and the failure of every worldly thing in respect of God's transcendence. But Lewis the poet allows himself a kind of cosmic mysticism, which I think is rather lovely.
Thank you, Malcolm. That's lovely. So leaving C.S. Lewis in his mystical space, perhaps this is a good moment to turn to Middle-earth. Now, when I first thought of this, my initial reaction was, okay, Middle-earth doesn't have Christmas or doesn't have a Christmas-style festival, but actually Kath has put me right. So, Kath, in Tolkien, in the Legendarium, that side of him, where do you go to celebrate Midwinter Festival?
Well, it's not immediately obvious, perhaps, but Middle-earth does actually have a fairly extensive Yuletide or Winter Festival tradition. And these are touched on, or perhaps a few different traditions, but they seem to me to be sort of linked. You'll find them touched upon, never really sort of brought out particularly in The Hobbit, in The Lord of the Rings and its appendices, and a couple of other places too. So, for example, you have to delve into the appendices sometimes. In Appendix D, we learn that the Shire celebrates 2 Yule days, which are the last and first days of the Old and New Years. These days were counted as outside the months. So the first month of the New Year was named after Yule, and the last month was for Yule. And this is a quote. In full, Tolkien adds, Yuletide was 6 days long, including the last 3 days and first 3 days of each year. And since the Shire calendar is based upon the Númenórean calendar known as King's Reckoning, I think we can probably safely assume that some sort of midwinter festival was also celebrated in Gondor, but that's an assumption. Anyway, so in The Hobbit, when Gandalf and Bilbo are returning from the Lonely Mountain, right at the end of the book, they are accompanied by Bjorn, and they stay at Bjorn's house for some time on their return journey and celebrate Yule there. And it says, Yuletide was warm and merry there, and men came from far and wide to feast at Bjorn's bidding, which I think would probably be rather nice because there'd be plenty of roast meats and honey. And at the end of the Return of the King, Frodo, and this is after the scouring of the Shire, Frodo and his friends are delighted to discover stores of goods, food, drink and tobacco, which have been stashed away by Saruman's ruffians and hidden in various places like the holes at Mickle Delving. Oh, and in the old quarries at Scarry. I presume it's Scarry rather than Scary. So that there was a great deal better cheer that Yule than anyone had hoped for. So the hobbits, I think we can safely assume, have a pretty good time at Yule. The Rohirrim, it turns out, also celebrate Yule, but the only description I can find of it is in Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, and it can hardly be typical, at least I hope not, because during the long winter in the time of Helm Hammerhand, Helm's Deep was besieged by the Dunlendings, and we have, in Helm's Deep there was a great hunger after Yule. Helm's son Hammer is lost in the snow after a foray, and Helm goes mad with grief, and dressed in white would stalk like a snow troll into the camps of his enemies and slay men with his hands. The Dunlendings said if he could find no food, he ate men. And there's a little quote here from Appendix A. Helm had a great horn, and it was marked that before he sallied forth, he would blow a blast upon it that echoed in the deep. And then so great a fear fell on his enemies that instead of gathering to take him or kill him, they fled away. One night, men heard the horn blowing, but Helm did not return. In the morning there came a sun gleam, the first for long days, and they saw a white figure standing still on the dyke, alone. There stood Helm, dead as a stone, but his knees were unbent. Yet men said that the horn was still heard at times in the deep, and the wraith of Helm would walk among the foes of Rohan and kill men with fear. So not terribly Christmassy story, but it was Yule.
Except there is a tradition of Christmas ghost stories, isn't there?
There is also a tradition of Christmas ghosts, and I think that's a pretty good Christmas ghost. In fact, it's all very northern and saga-like, which is unsurprising if you think that winter festivals do tend to be about celebrating and anticipating the return of the sun. and the rebirth of the year in the cold, dark season. And obviously, the further north you go, probably the more important these festivals become. And so, quite uniquely, I would say, for Middle-earth, the Dwarfs' Winter Festival celebrates a named individual. Durin's Day occurs on the first day of the last moon of autumn on the threshold of winter. And the legend tells us, this is relying upon the appendices again, tells us how Durin slept alone until in the deeps of time he was awakened. He's the great ancestor of the dwarfs and lived so long he was known as Durin the Deathless. Yet in the end he died before the elder days had passed, and his tomb was in Khazad-dûm, but his line never failed, and 5 times an heir was born, so like to his forefather that he received the name of Durin. He was indeed held by the dwarfs to be the deathless that returned. And so I think here, like Christmas, in Durin's Day, we have a winter festival that hangs upon a single personage who died and yet is reborn. Just a thought.
That's interesting, yeah.
My final example that I could find, which there may be others, but this was the result of my scouring of the legendarium. Anyway, I'm not sure this is in the legendarium, but in the Book of Lost Tales, the elves of Tol Eressëa celebrate a winter festival called Turuhalmi, or log drawing, which apparently involve games in the snow, the gathering of logs on sleighs, songs, drinking, and the telling of tales. So,
now, do you know, I'm so thrilled that I think there can't be a Tolkien fan out there listening to this who won't feel they've not got their money's worth, because yeah. I've never heard all of that put together quite so carefully.
No, I never have. Yeah, I remember Yule with Beorn, and that seemed absolutely right with Beorn. So, and Yule is really important. I mean, obviously, there's no way that, I mean, Tolkien would never have done, and never in a million years have done what Lewis did and introduced the word Christmas, no. Like that. He does, because the whole magic of Tolkien's thing persists on completely letting that secondary world be itself. Now, obviously, Tolkien's a deeply versed and profoundly faithful Christian, and therefore the great themes of light and darkness, the great themes of resurrection, indeed, and of course the profound theme. I mean, if I were to associate it with the Lord of the Rings, certainly with any kind of arc of the great Christian salvation story, it's much more about Good Friday, and then eventually, the eucatastrophe of resurrection. I mean, the epic towards the end. I mean, the whole epic, if you think about it, is an epic of letting go. That always strikes me as being an extraordinary thing. If you think of how Tolkien had within his grasp and embedded in his imagination the mythology, the entire mythology of the West and the North, for sure, and lots of others as well. And all the great quests, I think, without exception, somebody may correct me on this, but all the great quests associated with a treasure or a magical object of any kind are quests of acquisition. Jason's got to go and get the golden fleece. People have got to go and get the apples from the garden of the Hesperides. The hero is always going out to acquire something. And that something brings with it magical powers and makes the hero more of a hero, or gives them life, or whatever it is, or they brings restoration to their kingdom. Tolkien is unique in writing an epic of letting go. And that's why it's such a prophetic book now for the age of consumption, an age that's consuming itself to death, an age that's relying on the acquisition of various kinds of quasi-magical technologies just to extend life, but only spreading it out like butter spread over too much bread. Whereas the heart of this thing is the recognition that the real liberation will come from a renunciation, from a letting go. I mean, I think theologically that's to do with kenosis. I think it's to do with, they who was found in form equal with God, he did not cling to it. He emptied himself. But the whole ethos of it is an ethos of emptying rather than filling, which makes it less appropriate to a Christmas thing, but very appropriate to the mysteries of Good Friday and Easter. I think that's where I'd.
No, but it is appropriate to Christmas. I mean, it's not appropriate to Santa Claus and presents, but it's appropriate to the idea of God taking on human flesh as a tiny
Oh,
baby.
absolutely.
That's
Yes, it is very true.
completely what you see in the nativity plays and everything. That's
Yeah.
what they would all
that's
regard as the message of Christmas, I'm sure, both Tolkien and Lewis.
Lo here
that's
born, not the Virgin's womb, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. No, there's nothing. I wonder about you mentioned my doing a poem. Actually, this might be a really appropriate moment to throw a poem in, if I may.
oh, off you go. Throw a poem in. Yeah.
I wrote a poem some time ago called was published in my singing book called Descent, and I obviously, because it's a poem printed in the page, I had to spell the word descent, and I've spelt it DESCENT because it was about self-emptying this descent. But I wanted, when I read it, people to hear the other sense of descent, to dissent from something. And the idea here is that just as Tolkien reverses the legendarium, so there's a sense in which, in my view, the Christian story changes the great sort of classical late pagan antiquity, the kind of classical narrative of the Olympian gods, the gods on high, and the religious quest as being an ascent, and the gods being in every respect superior to human beings. And they are the immortals, we are the mortals. They are perfect and flawless, and we are subject to change and decay. So I wrote this poem, which just has a series of contrasts, in a sense, between the religious, the religions around, to which God, as it were, in the act of incarnation, says, "I beg to differ, I dissent." But so this is it. It's quite a short poem. It's written in English suffix, which is a meter George Herbert liked to use. And the reason I chose it is that it's 4 stress lines, but the last line of each quatrain is just 4 words, so it diminishes. Descent. They sought to soar into the skies, those classic gods of high renown, for lofty pride aspires to rise. But you came down. You dropped down from the mountains sheer, forsook the eagle for the dove. The other gods demanded fear, but you gave love. Where chiseled marble seemed to freeze their abstract and perfected form, compassion brought you to your knees. Your blood was warm. They called for blood in sacrifice, and victims on their altars bled. When no one else could pay the price, you died instead. They towered above our mortal plane, dismissed this restless flesh with scorn, aloof from birth and death and pain. But you were born to these burdens, borne by all, born with us all, astride the grave, weak to be with us when we fall, and strong to save.
that's lovely. Thank you so much, Malcolm. I
adore
hearing you read poetry. It's just wonderful. Thank you. So just to finish with Tolkien, before we move on to the whole question of fantasy and Christmas in wider frame, I had a little rootle around in things that weren't part of the, strictly speaking, the legendarium, and remembered that in The Smith of Wootton Major, the beginning of that story takes part of the big cake, special cake being made for the feast of the good children, which sounded like a quintessential Christmas thing, if ever there was one. Perhaps more like the St. Nicholas festival that a lot of the continental countries celebrate at the beginning of December. So that, I think, had an element of Christmassy about it. But of course, the big one is the fabulous The Father Christmas Letters, which is edited by Bailey Tolkien, who is Christopher Tolkien's second wife. I hadn't actually looked that up until today. I think this must be a first edition, actually. My husband's family were friendly with Tolkien back in the 1920s, so we always got like first editions of everything in the family, because which is great. But I pulled this off the shelf, and as you can see, this is based on a family tradition in the Tolkien household, where every year Tolkien would Father Christmas would write a letter to the children. What I find fascinating about this is you see all sorts of Tolkien skills coming into it. His skills as a calligrapher, his skills as a artist, his humor. He had quite a broad sense of humor. Some people found it a bit irritating, but actually it really suits a kid's sense of
totally.
humor, because people falling down and having accidents and all that kind of thing. But as you read it, what is really interesting is how it gets more and more complicated in the various worlds that are breaking into the sort of Father Christmas's workshop. And there's in the middle of the 30s, because each letter is dated, there's a big battle with the goblins. It's almost as if Tolkien cannot help himself. He has to go there. And then the latter part, some of the letters are actually from the chief elf, who's called Ilbereth.
Yeah.
So it gets very Tolkien-esque towards the end. And you'll be pleased. There was a rather splendid picture here of the polar bear in his bath.
I remember that. My mother got that and started reading them to us, and sending. We were quite older by then, but sent one. And the polar bear in his bath was a great favourite in our household.
Yes, I think the
polar bear generally is a character.
He is, absolutely.
He's a wonderful character.
He's the strongest one of all of them, and you get his runes at the end and his real name. So do read on to the end. But I think what's quite poignant, I'd love to see an adaptation of this, Tolkien estate, if you're listening. Let someone do this. I'd love to see an adaptation of this where it ends where it ends, because it ends in 1939, and there's this very sort of mournful but poignant feeling of what happens at the end of Christmas, and I think it captures that mood really well. And he's telling his children what's happening in the world via his own story of Father Christmas, saying, I expect you remember that some years ago we had trouble with the goblins and we thought we had settled it. Well, it broke out again this autumn, worse than it has been for centuries. And that's the last Father Christmas letter.
So poignant.
It is. So
he was so good with those, because he used to put the envelopes and make the lovely stamps from the North Pole and everything, and then deliver them to the door. And eventually he recruited the postman and got the postman actually to deliver the letters in person to the children, genuinely from the proper post bag. It was magnificent,
So in the last section of that, of what we're talking about today, I want to have just a brief look at how Christmas appears in fantasy, but also what we've done as writers with Christmas and the holiday season, shall we say. And I was thinking about just a very quick look at the famous Christmas stories, aside from the Christian narrative that appear on our screens every year. Loads of them are fantasy. You mentioned the Christmas ghost story. Well, of course, up there is the Christmas Carol.
Yes.
Yeah.
I try and read that every year. It's absolutely my favorite, because it captures the heart of that sort of sense of redemption and the generosity.
Yeah.
But also, you also mentioned the Snow Queen, which again has that, not only the snowy landscapes, but the idea of the heart melting, literally the heart melting, the shard of ice melting. And then, of course, the Nutcracker. I've done an adaptation for kids of the Nutcracker for an educational reader. And for that, I went back to the original Hoffman tale, which is much more interesting than the ballet. The ballet kind of only does a tiny fragment of the story. Oh. But the thing about the Hoffman tale is exactly Lucy's dilemma that she has when she comes back from the wardrobe. No one believes her. And the Nutcracker encapsulates that the same within that story, the fact that no one believes the heroine, that she's had all these adventures. So it's really worth going back to the original Nutcracker tale, as well as going to the ballet, which has another pleasure, I'm sure. But do you have any favorite Christmas stories that we haven't yet mentioned, particularly those of a fantasy genre that you bring out every year?
Well, the Box of Delights is my absolute must read again book for Christmas. And of course, it's just, I mean, I'm sure most people who listen to this who are listening to this will actually have come across it, if not the book itself, but the BBC adaptation, which is delightful. But there's Lucy Boston's The Children of Green Know, which which is, for anybody who doesn't know it, it's about an imaginative little boy called Tolly who goes to stay with his grandmother in a house in the Fens, or near the Fens, who makes playfellows out of the ghosts of the children who used to live there. This is based on the manor at Hemmingford Grey, which was Lucy Boston's own house, a marvellous place. And of course, as Christmas approaches, it just gets more and more and more Christmassy, but also with the assistance of his very benign little ghostly playfellows, they have to encounter the demon yew tree in the garden. So there's darkness as well. I always loved that book.
Kath, just to pick up, in case people haven't come across the Box of Delights, particularly if you're watching from America, it's by a writer called John Masefield, and it was originally published in 1935. So it's he's a contemporary, or just a little bit before, in a sense. And
he was poet laureate.
Yes.
Yeah, and a bit like the Green Know stories you mentioned, the Box of Delight definitely has the darkness as well as the light. It's a battle between the two.
Absolutely.
Beautifully done.
So does the gospel. I mean, it seems to me, especially with Matthew, that the point about the light in Christmas is that it's surrounded by darkness, just as the point about the warmth and the coziness and the feasting and the rich fruit, it's because it's cold and snowy outside.
Yeah.
So if you just do something which is nothing but fluffy niceness, it'll go nowhere. There has to be danger.
Yes.
There has to be a resistance to the darkness. All the best Christmas stories have got that.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
I think that's it. The Green Know. The Green Know stories are absolutely fabulous.
They're stunning. Absolutely stunning. Yeah.
I had a wonderful adventure in relation to them, in that when I came, I was an English teacher for a while. It was my first job, and I happened to be teaching in St Ives, near Huntingdon, not far from Hemmingford Grey, where the house is. But I knew nothing of that. I had read the Green Know stories at the same time that I read the Narnia ones, and therefore it was all in the same world. And I was talking to the head of the English department there and saying, I want to do The Children of Green Know, and he said, "Oh well, you ought to go over and go over to the house then and have a word with Lucy Boston. I can give you an introduction." And he might as well have said, "By the way, the wardrobe is in my room.
Yes.
You can just step into Narnia." It was exactly, and so I did. And I was just thrilled because the house is just as it, and Peter Boston's lovely drawings. And Lucy Boston was exactly as I'd imagined Mrs. Oldknow. And in fact, by great good fortune, came to know her quite well. And at one point, she asked me if I would stay there for a while and be her amanuensis. She was writing poetry, about wonderful poetry at that time. But I just got engaged to Maggie, and we were being engaged. We were about to get married. So I said to her, my dear, you have a rival, and she's 90. So I've frozen. I don't know if
No, you're still going, Malcolm. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. So anyway, Maggie came over and met her, and we had a lovely time walking in the rose garden.
How wonderful! Yeah,
I regard her as one of the great writers.
She's a marvelous writer, absolutely marvelous. But I have a couple more. So this is Leon Garfield's response to the Christmas Carol, Mr. Corbett's Ghost, and it's well worth reading, I think. And can I go on? I've got
because I think we should always leave people with a reading list.
Okay,
definitely.
This is very new. Catherine Fisher's The Clockwork Crow is absolutely enchanting. There are 2 sequels, and it follows the adventures of a little girl, a Victorian orphan, who takes a winter train ride to an old Welsh mansion where she has to outwit the dangerous Welsh fairies, the Tylwyth Teg, if that's how you pronounce them, with the aid of the crotchety Clockwork Crow, and I highly recommend them.
I think it's always good to remember that we don't stop with Tolkien and Lewis. We're going on to look at new writing. Just to, we're going to hop into Harry Potter just briefly, because of course I think there is a big, strong association still with Harry Potter and Christmas, thanks to the fact that J.K. Rowling does a school year. And
yes, exactly.
School year features Christmas heavily. So of course you've got all the images. And I think her use of it shows the side that you either do the full-on celebration, but you also use it to contrast the loneliness of a character. And that, I think, works particularly well with Harry when he's outside of, that's the bit which I think is most poignant, and when he's outside of everybody else's celebration. So if you're thinking about using it, if anyone's listening to this and is doing a fantasy world where Christmas fits, that's a really good use of it, is to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
But Malcolm and Kath, I'm now going to put you on the spot as writers to find out, well, you could recommend one of your books as a Christmas present if you want. Kath, I think you should definitely do that. But Malcolm, you've written a whole Advent book, which I actually spent one Advent doing, I think last year. So please tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is called Waiting on the Word, a poem a day for Advent, Christmas and Epiphany. And it's an anthology. I mean, it's mostly classic poems, and it has one or two of my own, but what I do is I give you the poem, but then I write a very short reflective essay. I found that people find it quite helpful to have something opened out for them. And I try and take the sort of Advent journey, which in a sense, of course, starts really, if one's thinking of the advent of Christ at Christmas. I mean, there are other senses of Advent too, but if one's thinking of the advent of Christ at Christmas, it has to start with the Annunciation, really, and Mary's various preparations. So I have some Annunciation poems. I have the great Milton poem in there that Lewis riffed on so much. I have my own sequence of 7 poems on the great Advent antiphons, the 7 great O's, which I love, which are these kind of mystical titles of Christ. I have a poem of my own about Christmas Day and so on in it. But I then go on into Epiphany and take the story forward, and I wrote a poem about the wise men coming, and I sometimes chosen secular poems as well, not just directly religious ones, that are, I think, observations of the season that just enter into the spirit of the whole thing. There's a wonderful poem by the contemporary poet Greville Lindop about watching moons change in the winter sky, and wanting to give each of these moons in their different phases to his wife, and having to sort of give her the poem with the moons in them instead. So yeah, I really enjoyed doing it, and it seems to sort of continue to kind of live a life of its own. It also gave me a chance to bring in some poets who I think have been unjustly neglected. I mean, I've got a couple of poems in here by Ruth Pitter, who I think is a really fine poet, was much admired by Lewis. There's a beautiful poem of hers, a mystical poem called A Bird in the Tree I've got here. So yeah, it was very good fun to put together, and it seems to sort of have carried on with a life of its own. And I what I did for people who enjoy reading it but would like to hear the poems read, people have sometimes said to me it's nice if I read the poems. So I have recorded all these poems, and on my blog over the Advent season, in a sort of weekly post, I post up the recordings of all that week's poems and the texts of them, so people who are reading the book can sort of press a button and hear me recite the poem, which sometimes opens it out a bit.
Okay, we'll put a link to that in the show notes, as they call it on these things, so people can find those. Kath, now I've got your book here. I'm going to bring it in. There we go. So this is a very good present to anybody who is remembering their childhood and their reading of the Narnia stories in particular. Tell us a little bit about this and what you cover.
Well, so because I was so passionate about the Narnia books when I was a little girl, when I came to the end of them, and I'm sure many other children did this too, I wrote a book of my own stories about Narnia. I was 9, 10, that sort of age. And that sort of got me writing. That got me writing seriously. I never really stopped writing after that. I just carried on writing books. I mean, loads of unpublished manuscripts upstairs. Unpublished and unpublishable, I should say. So Spare Oom, it's called, got my own copy. I think this may be back to front, but it says, From Spare Oom to Wardrobe, Travels in Narnia with my 9-year-old self. it's sort of product of the gift of the silver chair that my mother gave me so long ago, I suppose. So I sort of explored my own childhood memories of reading the book, which I remember very, very clearly, rather as Malcolm can, often quite exactly where I was and what I was doing when I was reading the books for the first time. But also I thought it would be interesting to sort of have a dialogue between myself as a child and myself now, and as an adult sort of tease out some of the threads from the extraordinarily rich tapestry of references that Lewis weaves into those books, which we have touched upon. I mean, not just from Christianity, but also from Plato, Greek mythology, fairy tales, medieval literature, Bunyan, Milton, George MacDonald, you name it. It just goes on and on and on. And I find that fascinating. And I think the book is reasonably readable. So that's my most recent book. As far as myself as a novelist goes, this is a few years old now, but it's called Dark Angels. It was published by HarperCollins, and it's a middle grade book for children. And it's a Christmassy book. It's called The Shadow Hunt in the United States. It's a winter book set in the Welsh marches in the late 12th century, and it begins in autumn and comes to Christmas climax of snow, danger, ghosts, devils, elves, and angels. So have I got time to read a tiny bit?
Yeah. The beauty of this kind of format is we don't have to cut to a commercial break or anything. So
okay.
You can just keep going.
There's a bit towards the end, it's not the end, you can see, where my two characters, there's a boy called Wolf and a girl called Nest. And for various reasons, they've agreed to meet on the top of the tower of the Motte and Bailey Castle, La Motte Rouge, which is where they both are living at the moment, on Christmas morning, because they've been told that if you go there on Christmas morning at sunrise, you might be able to see the angels dancing in the sun. So this is a bit where it goes, Wolf swept snow from the rail. They leaned on it looking east. Every moment the colour in the sky grew stronger. A vast cloud stood high over Crow Moor. It flushed rose and peach and gold and began to brighten beyond colour into pure light. Out of nowhere, a small wind ruffled their faces. Christus natus est! Christ is born! Far below their feet a cock crowed, wild and shrill. A goblet of fire, too bright to look at, rose over the rim of the world. Fields and woods leaped to life. Rays of light struck across the valley, and the snow-crusted edge of the rail where they leaned turned all to diamonds. A lump came into Wolf's throat. Poised here on the tower, high above the world, his hard decisions and troubles seemed tiny and unimportant. Nest grabbed his hand. "Oh, Wolf," she breathed, "look!" Above the joyful, blazing disk of the sun, the sky was like hammered silver. White sparks appeared in it, like morning stars. Wolf squinted between the bars of his fingers. Far, far away, leaving streaks and curls of fire, the angels danced like a flock of birds before the sun, their immeasurably distant wings flashing. So that's a Christmas moment.
Lovely.
Thank you.
So I suppose I should now say something completely different, because I was thinking I don't have a Christmas book, and I realised I actually do.
Oh, good.
One of I write under 3 names, and one of them is Joss Sterling, and also published by HarperCollins. I have a murder mystery at Christmas. Is that traditional? Called Red.
Yes.
And it's actually inspired by the area in which Tolkien's house is actually situated. Even though we didn't manage to get the house, I'm fascinated by that area and all the arrival of particularly Russian oligarchs buying up the property around there, which is partly why it was so expensive. And I think maybe it was me working things through. I've written a murder mystery set in houses around there, but the presiding fantasy genius is actually Alice in Wonderland. The connection being to Lewis Carroll. And in fact, that's how you solve the puzzle, is knowing what happens in what order in Alice in Wonderland. So that's called Red House. But there are dead bodies. So it's an adult novel rather than a Christmas family read. Thank you so much, Malcolm and Catherine, for doing this chat with us today. I have really learned a lot. and I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you about always winter and never Christmas, because I think we've actually tippled over from the always winter into Christmas and the crocuses.
I like your word. I like your word tipple there.
Yeah.
You know, if it's any other season you tipped over it, but if it's Christmas, you should definitely tipple over it.
Definitely, yes. So thank you very much, and it's very kind of you to give us all this time. So thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you for enjoying. Thank you very much. We've enjoyed it. I certainly have.
Yeah. Yes, I have too. Thank you.